The first time I saw the man I was ordered to marry, he was kneeling in a garden on Threshold Station, whispering to a wounded bird that had somehow gotten trapped in the ventilation system. His fingers were careful around its broken wing, and his voice was so gentle that I stopped walking and stared at him for nearly a full minute before he noticed me standing there. This was supposed to be a killer. This was supposed to be one of the most decorated combat officers in the entire Terran military. Commander Declan Holt, the man who had burned through 3 Kelthari defense lines during the Battle of Vaynara Crossing and held a besieged continent on Kalos 4 for 72 days against a force that outnumbered his own 11-1. He looked up at me with dirt on his knees and a bird cradled against his chest, and he smiled like I was the most interesting thing he had seen all day. My name is Selara Vosrine. I am the youngest daughter of Sovereign Aldrin Vosrine, ruler of the Kelthari High Sovereignty, and I had just been traded like currency to end a war that had already killed 14 million people across 2 species. The Kelthari-Terran border wars had lasted 3 years. 3 years of burning stations and shattered fleet formations, and colony worlds turned to glass. We had started it, if I am honest. The sovereignty had expanded into a resource corridor that the Terran Admiralty considered strategically vital, and neither side had been willing to blink first. By the time the diplomats finally agreed to talk, both civilizations were bleeding from wounds that would take a generation to heal. The peace treaty required a symbol, something permanent, something that could not be unsigned or revoked, or quietly shelved when political winds changed direction. My father's advisors suggested a bonding, a political marriage between a daughter of the sovereignty and a Terran officer of equivalent rank. It was an ancient tradition among our people, one that carried the weight of sacred law. Once bonded, neither government could resume hostilities without dissolving the union first, and dissolving a sovereign bonding carried consequences that no politician wanted to face. I volunteered before my sisters could be asked. Talira had children. Maisha was pregnant with her first. I was the youngest, unbonded, and had spent enough time studying human combat footage to believe I could survive proximity to one of them without losing my composure. I was wrong about that, but not in the way I expected. The bonding ceremony on Threshold Station was a cold, efficient affair. Diplomats from both sides filled the observation hall, their faces carefully neutral, their applause precisely calibrated to suggest enthusiasm without actually containing any. Declan stood across from me in his dress uniform, his posture straight but not rigid, his expression calm in a way that I initially mistook for indifference. He spoke the bonding vows in Kelthari. His pronunciation was terrible. His grammar was worse. He had clearly been practicing for weeks, and had still managed to conjugate half the verbs in the wrong tense, which in our language accidentally turned a promise of partnership into something closer to a promise to share breakfast regularly. I heard 2 of my father's advisors suppress laughter behind their diplomatic masks. But Declan did not look embarrassed. He looked directly at me while he spoke, and there was something in his eyes that I did not expect to find there. Not desire, not conquest. Something quieter than both. Something that looked almost like an apology. That night, aboard the quarters we now shared on Threshold Station, I braced myself for what I assumed would come next. I had studied human bonding customs. I understood what they typically expected from a wedding night. I had prepared myself for it, the way I prepared for most unpleasant duties, with discipline and detachment. Declan set up a folding cot in the adjacent room. He showed me the lock on my bedroom door, demonstrated that it engaged from my side only, and told me he would be next door if I needed anything. Then he wished me good night in that same fractured Kelthari, and he closed the door behind him. I stood in that room for a long time, staring at the locked door, trying to understand what had just happened. Over the weeks that followed, I studied my husband the way I had been trained to study intelligence targets. I watched his patterns, cataloged his habits, searched for the cracks in whatever mask he was wearing. He woke before me every morning. He made a Terran drink called coffee in a small machine he had brought from his previous posting, and the smell filled our quarters with something bitter and warm that I found deeply unpleasant. He noticed my reaction on the second day and started brewing it in the ventilated kitchen alcove so the scent would not reach my sleeping chamber. He never mentioned it, he just adjusted. He read tactical journals during the morning hours, dense publications filled with fleet engagement analyses and logistical theory. He exercised alone in the station gymnasium, running distances that would have put a Kelthari endurance specialist to shame. He ate simple meals. He kept his space clean without being obsessive about it. And he asked me questions. Not interrogation, not intelligence gathering. He asked me about Kelthari poetry. He asked me about the seasonal light festivals on our homeworld. He asked me what my favorite color was, and when I told him it was the deep violet of our twilight sky, he reprogrammed the ambient lighting in the common room to shift toward that spectrum in the evenings. He learned my dietary needs from the medical files the diplomats had exchanged during negotiations, and he adjusted the kitchen systems to accommodate them without being asked. When I mentioned that I found the station's recycled air uncomfortably dry, he requisitioned a humidity unit for our quarters and installed it himself. I reported to my father during a private diplomatic channel session that the human was manageable, cooperative, not what we had expected. My father asked me if Declan had shown any signs of aggression, any hints of the battlefield ferocity that the intelligence reports described. I told him no. I told him the man seemed almost gentle. What I did not tell my father was that I was beginning to look forward to our evening conversations. Declan had a way of listening that I had never encountered in a Kelthari male. He did not wait for his turn to speak. He actually absorbed what I said, turned it over in his mind, and responded to the substance of my words rather than their political implications. He treated me like a person instead of a treaty provision. I began to wonder if the Terran Admiralty had made a mistake. Perhaps they had sent me a defective soldier, someone too soft for combat, who had been promoted beyond his abilities and shuffled into a diplomatic role because he was no longer useful on the front lines. It would explain the gentleness. It would explain why a man with his service record seemed more interested in gardening and poetry than in warfare. I held on to that theory for exactly 31 days. On the 32nd day, a priority transmission arrived from the outer sectors. I was in the common room reading when the alert tone cut through the station's ambient noise, sharp and urgent, in a way that made my skin prickle. Declan was in the kitchen, washing dishes by hand, because he said the mechanical cleaners did not get them properly clean. He dried his hands slowly. He walked to the communications terminal. He opened the channel. The transmission was from a Kelthari border monitoring station in the Valen Expanse, the vast stretch of uncharted space that bordered the far edge of our colonial territories. The officer on screen was young, barely older than a cadet, and his voice was shaking so badly that I could barely understand his words through the distortion. An armada, unidentified, massive, crossing the expanse in a formation that the monitoring station's computers could not fully resolve because there were too many ships for the sensors to count individually. They were burning hard toward Kelthari colonial space, and they were not responding to any communication attempts on any frequency. The signal degraded. The young officer's face dissolved into static. The transmission died. I turned to look at Declan. He was standing perfectly still beside the terminal. His hands hung at his sides, loose and relaxed. His breathing was even, measured, controlled in a way that suddenly looked nothing like calm and everything like preparation. His eyes were fixed on the dead screen, but he was not looking at it. He was looking through it, at something vast and distant that existed only inside his own mind. The temperature in the room had not changed. The environmental systems confirmed that when I checked later. But something cold moved through that space between us, something that settled against my skin like frost. And for the first time since I had met him, I felt afraid of the man I had married. Not because he had changed, because I was beginning to realize that he had never been what I thought he was. The reports started arriving in waves over the next 6 hours, each one worse than the last. Kelthari long-range patrol ships confirmed the contact. The approaching armada was not a rogue fleet or a pirate confederation. It was an organized military force of staggering scale, moving with the disciplined precision of a civilization that had been conquering its way across the galaxy for decades. Intelligence identified them within the first 2 hours. The Droxari Ascendancy. The name carried weight even in Kelthari databases that had never encountered them directly. A conquest empire from beyond the charted rim. An expansionist civilization that had swallowed 11 species in 60 years and showed no signs of slowing down. They did not negotiate. They did not accept surrender. They arrived, they overwhelmed, and they absorbed. Every species they had encountered had either been conquered or exterminated, and the difference between those two outcomes seemed to depend entirely on the Droxary's mood at the time. Their fleet outnumbered everything the Kelthari sovereignty could field by a factor of 4. I watched my people's military commanders react to this information in real time, through the diplomatic channels that were still open between Threshold Station and the sovereignty's capital. I watched seasoned admirals, officers who had fought through the border wars without flinching, struggle to maintain their composure as the scale of the threat became clear. My father contacted me on a private channel. His face was composed, the way it always was during a crisis, but I knew him well enough to see the fractures beneath the surface. His voice cracked once, just for a moment, when he told me that the Droxari vanguard was projected to reach the first Kelthari colony world within 72 hours. 12 billion people lived on our homeworld, hundreds of millions more across the colonial territories. The Kelthari had never faced an existential threat. We had fought border skirmishes. We had engaged in the border wars with the Terrans, but we had never looked at an enemy and seen extinction looking back. Declan had been listening to the intelligence reports on a separate terminal, running the data through analytical frameworks I did not recognize. When the last report finished, he stood up, walked to the primary communications console, and opened a channel to Terran command. I expected what I always expected from military bureaucracies: delays, committees, political calculations about whether intervening on behalf of a former enemy was worth the cost. I expected to watch my husband navigate weeks of diplomatic procedure, while the Droxari burned their way toward my people. What I witnessed instead was something I had no framework to understand. Declan's voice dropped, not in volume, but in register, in texture, as if someone had removed a layer of insulation from something hard and precise underneath. His language changed. The warm, slightly awkward man who mispronounced Kelthari verbs and talked to wounded birds disappeared, and in his place stood someone who spoke in clipped, surgical phrases, loaded with terminology and authorization codes that I could not follow. He did not request assistance. He did not ask for consultation. He requested activation. He used words like contingency and expeditionary mandate and sovereign defense protocol, and the officers on the other end of the channel responded to those words with an immediacy that made it clear they had been waiting for exactly this kind of call. Within 1 hour, Terran fast response fleets began redirecting from 3 separate sectors. Within 2 hours, supply chains were being rerouted to support a sustained military deployment in Kelthari space. Within 4 hours, the largest Terran military mobilization since the border wars was underway, and Declan had initiated all of it with a single communication session. He ended the call, turned off the terminal, and looked at me. His eyes were the same gentle brown they had always been. His expression was the same quiet patience I had grown accustomed to over our weeks together. But I saw it now, the architecture behind those eyes, the vast, intricate machinery of a mind that had never been idle, never been soft, never been anything less than what it was. Every quiet morning, every gentle question about poetry and twilight skies, every small kindness with the kitchen systems and the humidity controls, all of it had been a choice. A deliberate, sustained choice made by a man who could just as easily choose something entirely different. The gentleness was not the mask. The war was the mask. And the mask was about to go on. 3 days later, the Kelthari High Command convened an emergency war council at Sovereignty headquarters on our homeworld. I attended as a diplomatic observer, which was my right, as a bonded daughter of the sovereign. Declan accompanied me as my consort, which technically gave him observer status as well. The council chamber was an imposing space, carved from the black stone of the Vosran mountain range, lit by floating bioluminescent orbs that cast everything in a cold blue glow. 26 Kelthari admirals and war masters sat around the crescent table, each one representing a fleet division or a strategic command sector. They were the best military minds our civilization had produced, trained from adolescence in the arts of space warfare and fleet tactics. They barely acknowledged Declan when we entered. A few glanced at him with the polite disinterest that Kelthori culture reserves for individuals who are present, but not relevant. He was, in their eyes, a political accessory. A treaty ornament, the human they had to tolerate, because the peace agreement required his existence. Declan took his seat beside me, folded his hands on the table, and said nothing. The senior admiral, a veteran named Korath Vaishal, who had commanded the sovereignty's fleets for over 40 years, presented the defensive strategy. It was thorough, detailed, and built on decades of Kelthari military doctrine. The plan called for a systematic withdrawal from the outer colonies, consolidating all available forces around the three most defensible worlds in the inner system, and establishing a layered defensive perimeter designed to bleed the Droxari fleet through sustained attrition. The admirals discussed the plan for over an hour. They debated reinforcement schedules, supply logistics, fallback positions, and evacuation priorities. They argued about which colonies to sacrifice first, treating the loss of millions of civilians as an acceptable mathematical trade-off for the survival of the inner worlds. Declan listened through all of it without moving. His expression did not change. His hands stayed folded. His breathing stayed even. He might have been sleeping with his eyes open for all the admirals cared. Then, during a pause in the discussion, he spoke. One sentence. One question. He asked about the Droxari supply chain structure. The room went quiet, not because the question was rude, but because it was a question none of the admirals had thought to ask. Their entire strategy was built around defending against the Droxari attack force. No one had examined how that force sustained itself. No one had considered where the fuel, the ammunition, the replacement parts, and the food supplies were coming from, or how far they had to travel to reach the front lines. Admiral Korath looked at Declan with an expression that shifted from mild irritation to grudging attention. He directed an intelligence officer to pull the relevant data. The answer, when it came, changed the shape of the entire conversation. The Droxari supply corridor stretched back nearly 400 light-years, through a chain of relay stations and depot worlds that the Ascendancy had established during their advance across the rim. The corridor was long, thinly defended, and absolutely critical to sustaining their fleet's operations in Kelthari space. Without it, the Armada had fuel and ammunition reserves for approximately 18 days of sustained combat operations. After that, they were stranded. Declan began to dismantle the Kelthari defense plan, not with arrogance, not with the contempt I had seen from human officers during the border wars. He did it with a calm, surgical clarity that treated every assumption the admirals had made as a puzzle to be solved, rather than an ego to be challenged. He explained, in precise and measured language, that the defensive strategy was designed to lose slowly, rather than fight to win. Pulling back and consolidating would give the Droxari exactly what they wanted: a concentrated target, and the initiative to choose when and where to engage. Attrition worked only when you had more resources than your enemy, and the Kelthari did not. Instead, he proposed something that made half the admirals in the room look at him as if he had lost his mind. He wanted to split the Allied fleet into 7 independent strike groups, each composed of mixed Terran and Kelthari crews. These groups would conduct simultaneous deep penetration raids along the Droxari supply corridor, destroying relay stations and depot worlds in a coordinated cascade that would sever the Armada's lifeline within 48 hours. Meanwhile, a single bait force, heavily armed but deliberately small, would draw the main Droxari Armada into a gravity well kill zone near a dying star at the edge of the system, where the star's gravitational distortion would limit the Droxari's ability to maneuver and negate their numerical advantage. Admiral Korath called the plan reckless. 2 other admirals called it suicidal. A third pointed out that splitting the fleet would leave no reserves if any of the strike groups failed. Declan acknowledged every objection. Then he walked them through the logistics, the timing windows for each strike group's approach vector, the fuel consumption calculations that proved the raids could be completed within the 18-day supply window, the gravitational modeling of the dying star that showed precisely how the kill zone would constrain Droxari fleet movements, the failure margins for each phase of the operation, including contingencies for the loss of up to 2 strike groups without compromising the overall objective. Every number checked out, every calculation held. The plan was not reckless. It was terrifying, because it was precise, because it required a level of coordination and timing that most military strategists would consider theoretically possible, but practically unachievable. Declan presented it as if he were discussing a recipe for breakfast. The council voted. The plan passed by a margin of 3 votes, with most of the senior admirals voting against it and most of the younger commanders voting in favor. It did not matter. The sovereign, my father, had the final authority, and he looked at Declan for a long moment before authorizing the operation. That night, in our quarters on the Sovereignty homeworld, I confronted my husband. I asked him how long he had been hiding what he really was. How long he had been wearing the mask of the gentleman who read poetry and adjusted kitchen systems and talked to wounded birds, while something entirely different waited underneath. He looked at me with those same calm brown eyes, and he told me he had not been hiding anything. He was exactly the man who kneeled in gardens and made terrible coffee and learned Celtthry grammar badly on purpose, because he thought my people's suppressed laughter at his pronunciation was the fastest way to make them see him as a person rather than a threat. But he was also the man who had commanded the 9th Terran Assault Division through the siege of Kalos IV, where his unit had held a continent for 72 days against 11-to-1 odds by converting the planet's own geography into a weapon system. He was the man who had written 3 of the tactical doctrine manuals that the Terran Admiralty used as standard training texts. He was the man whose name appeared in Draxari intelligence files with a classification level that translated roughly to existential level threat. Both things were true. Both things were him. The gentleness, he told me, was not weakness. It was a choice. And it was harder than the violence. Any human could be taught to fight. The ones worth knowing were the ones who had to be given a reason. I asked him what his reason was now. He said my name. Just my name. And then he said, your family, your world, and the 12 billion people who are going to wake up tomorrow not knowing that someone is coming to end everything they have ever built. I stood there in the low violet light of our quarters, looking at a man I had been married to for barely 5 weeks, and I realized that I had never understood humans at all. I had studied their combat footage. I had analyzed their tactical doctrines. I had read psychological profiles and cultural assessments, and diplomatic briefings that filled hundreds of pages. And all of it, every single word, had made the same fundamental error. We assumed the kindness was the mask. We assumed the politeness and the curiosity and the gentle questions about poetry were camouflage over the predator underneath. It was the opposite. The kindness was the truth. The war was the mask. And the mask was about to come on. Mobilization happened faster than I thought possible. Within 2 days, Threshold Station had been transformed from a diplomatic outpost into a forward operating base, its corridors stripped of decorative panels and filled with weapons crates, communication relays, and the organized chaos of a military staging ground. The Terran warships began arriving on the 3rd day. I had seen Terran vessels before. During the border wars, I had watched recordings of their diplomatic escorts and patrol frigates, sleek and standardized ships that looked like they had been designed by committee. The ships that dropped out of fold space around Threshold Station were nothing like those. These were deep war vessels, ships with scarred hulls and carbon-scored armor plating, ships whose weapons systems carried classification codes that our intelligence databases could not decipher. Their names were painted on their bows in blocky Terran script: the Hargrave, the Callaway, the Iron Meridian, the Blackthorn. Names that carried no meaning in Kelthari language, but seemed to resonate with something primal in the Terran crews who served aboard them. The crews themselves were quiet, professional, and moved through the station with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this before and expected to do it again. They did not celebrate their arrival. They did not boast about their capabilities. They checked their equipment, reviewed their assignments, and went to work. And they looked at Declan differently than the diplomats had. The diplomats had treated him like a political prop. These soldiers looked at him the way warriors look at someone who has brought them home from places where home should not have been possible. There was no worship in it. There was something deeper. Trust, earned through fire, maintained through shared memory of things that could not be explained to anyone who had not been there. Declan briefed the strike group commanders in a sealed tactical room aboard the Hargrave, his flagship. I was not supposed to attend, but my status as a sovereign daughter of the Keltari granted me clearance that neither the Terran nor Keltari military could overrule without creating a diplomatic incident. So I sat in the corner and watched. He presented the battle plan with the same measured calm he used for everything else. 7 strike groups. 7 simultaneous deep penetration raids on the Draxari supply corridor. A bait force to draw the main armada into the gravity well kill zone. Timing windows, measured in minutes. Margins of error, measured in seconds. The Terran commanders absorbed the briefing without visible reaction. They asked technical questions about fuel reserves, engagement protocols, and extraction contingencies. They did not ask if the plan was possible. They did not ask if it was wise. They treated the plan's existence as sufficient evidence that it could be executed, because Declan Holt had designed it, and Declan Holt did not design plans that could not be executed. The Kelthari officers in the room were less certain. Commander Valen Tirash, assigned to lead one of the mixed strike groups, voiced concerns about the coordination required between species that had been trying to kill each other 5 weeks earlier. How could Terran and Kelthari crews operate in sync when they had never trained together, never served together, never even shared a tactical frequency? Declan answered with a question. He asked Valen what the Kelthari word was for someone who fights beside you against a common enemy. Valen said the word was Salvethri, which translated roughly to shield kin. Declan said the Terran word was ally, and that the meaning was functionally identical, and that anyone who could hold a weapon and follow orders was capable of being one. It was not a profound answer. It was barely even a reassuring one. But the way he said it, with absolute certainty and not a trace of doubt, made it sound like a law of physics rather than an opinion. Then I did something that surprised both of us. I demanded a place on Declan's flagship. He refused, immediately, firmly, with the first hint of genuine hardness I had ever heard in his voice. The Hargrave would be leading the bait force. It would be the ship, drawing the full attention of the Draxari armada toward the kill zone. It would be, by design, the most dangerous place in the entire theater of operations. I overrode him. My authority as a bonded sovereign daughter of the Kelthari High Sovereignty technically outranked his Terran military commission aboard any allied vessel operating in Kelthari space. It was a technicality. It was also legally unassailable. Declan knew it. He stared at me for a long moment. His jaw tightened, his hands stayed perfectly still at his sides. I thought he was angry. Later, much later, I would understand that he was not angry. He was afraid. Not of the coming battle. Not of the Draxari armada. He was afraid of what I would see when the fighting started. He was afraid of what I would think of him after I watched him become the thing he spent every quiet morning trying not to be. He nodded once. He said, "Stay on the bridge. Do not leave the bridge." He said it twice, and I agreed. The bait force departed Threshold Station at dawn on the 5th day. 7 ships, led by the Hargrave. Behind us, invisible on 7 separate approach vectors, the strike groups burned toward their targets along the Draxari supply corridor. The timing required all 8 elements of the operation to reach their objectives within a 4-minute window. 4 minutes. Across hundreds of light-years of space, involving thousands of crew members from 2 species that had been enemies less than 6 weeks ago. I stood on the bridge of the Hargrave and watched the stars stretch as we entered fold space, and I thought about the wounded bird in the garden. I wondered if it had survived. I wondered if Declan had checked. The Draxari Vanguard appeared on long-range sensors 6 hours into our approach. They were exactly where Declan had predicted they would be, positioned in an aggressive advance formation along the corridor toward the first Keltari colony world. Their fleet was enormous. Even on the sensor display, reduced to abstract symbols and numerical designations, the sheer scale of it was difficult to process. Hundreds of warships, dozens of capital-class vessels, and somewhere in the center of that formation, a dreadnought so massive that the sensors classified it as a station before the analysis algorithms corrected themselves. The Eternal Mandate, the Draxari flagship, a vessel nearly 3 kilometers long, bristling with weapon systems that our databases could not fully categorize. Declan looked at the sensor display the same way he looked at everything else, with calm, focused attention and no visible emotion. He gave orders in a low, steady voice that carried across the bridge without effort. Adjust heading by 0.3 degrees. Reduce fold space exit velocity by 12%. Bring weapons systems to ready standby, but do not activate targeting arrays until his command. The bridge crew responded with the mechanical precision of people who had rehearsed these procedures so many times that they no longer required conscious thought. Each officer moved their hands across their stations with the fluid certainty of instinct, and I realized that every person on this bridge had served with Declan before. They were not assigned crew. They were his crew. They had followed him here because they trusted that wherever he led them, there would be a way back. We dropped out of fold space directly in front of the Draxari vanguard. It was deliberate, provocative, an act designed to force a reaction before the Draxari had time to analyze the tactical situation. 7 ships against an armada of hundreds, appearing from nowhere with weapons hot and engines burning at full military power. The Draxari responded exactly as Declan had predicted. The vanguard broke formation and turned to engage, their aggressive instincts overriding the cautious tactical assessment that might have told them something was wrong. You do not charge headlong at 7 ships when you have hundreds. You probe, you encircle, you analyze. But the Draxari were conquerors, not strategists. They had spent 60 years overpowering everything in their path with raw numbers and brute force, and they had never encountered an enemy who used their aggression as a weapon against them. Declan fought from the command chair. I stood 6 meters away, close enough to hear every order he gave, close enough to watch his face as the battle unfolded around us. He processed information from 14 data streams simultaneously. Sensor feeds, communication channels, tactical overlays, damage reports, ammunition counts, fleet positioning data, all of it flowing into him in a continuous torrent that would have overwhelmed any Kelthari commander I had ever observed. He did not prioritize or filter. He absorbed it all, held it all, and issued orders that addressed multiple variables in single sentences. When a Kelthari cruiser in our formation took a direct hit to its port engine array and began losing thrust, Declan rerouted 3 ships to cover its evacuation arc, without pausing the sentence he was already speaking to a different station. The cruiser's crew had 12 seconds between the damage alert and the arrival of covering fire. 12 seconds. He had calculated the response before the hit occurred, not because he predicted the specific damage, but because he had already mapped every possible failure point in the formation and preloaded responses for each one. When a Draxari destroyer broke formation and attempted to flank our position, Declan exploited the gap it left in the enemy line within 4 seconds. He sent 2 frigates through the opening, positioned them behind the Draxari forward screen, and used their weapons to force the destroyers in that sector to choose between pursuing the frigates and maintaining formation integrity. They could not do both. They chose wrong. I had seen Kelthari war masters command fleets. I had watched recordings of Admiral Korath directing the Battle of Vaynara from the tactical center, his officers relaying information through a chain of command that filtered data upward through 6 layers of analysis before it reached the Admiral's attention. It was organized. It was methodical. It was exactly how a sophisticated civilization waged war. Declan did not use layers. He did not filter. He sat in the center of a storm of information and moved through it the way a predator moves through water, not fighting the current, but becoming part of it, finding the paths of least resistance and the pressure points where a small force applied at the right moment could redirect the entire flow. His hands did not shake. His pulse, displayed on the command chair's biometric readout where the bridge crew could see it and take confidence from its steadiness, never exceeded 60 beats per minute. He was not calm. Calm is the absence of stress. What I saw on that bridge was something different. It was a man operating at a level of cognitive intensity that should have been impossible for a biological mind, sustained not by adrenaline, but by something deeper, something that had been forged over years of practice and hardened by battles that most people would not survive once. The bait force pulled the Draxari vanguard away from the colony corridor and toward the kill zone, drawing them deeper into the gravitational distortion field of the dying star with each controlled retreat. The Draxari followed because they could not help themselves. Their doctrine demanded pursuit. Their instincts demanded the kill. And behind them, 700 light-years away, the strike groups hit their targets. The first Draxari supply depot detonated at 1400 hours, ship time. The second followed 3 minutes later. The third, fourth, and fifth went down in a cascade that rippled along the entire supply corridor, like dominoes falling in slow motion across the void. Relay stations, fuel reserves, ammunition caches, communication nodes. All of it, the entire logistical infrastructure that sustained the Draxari Armada's operations in Kelthari space, burning. The Draxari did not know it yet. They were still chasing us toward the dying star, still focused on the 7 ships in front of them, still operating under the assumption that this was a conventional engagement, and that their supply lines would be there when they needed them. By the time they figured out what had happened, it would be too late. The gravity well of the dying star wrapped around the Draxari formation like a fist. Their ships, designed for overwhelming frontal assault and not for precision maneuvering in distorted spacetime, began to drift out of formation as the gravitational tides pulled at their hulls. Their engines burned harder to compensate, consuming fuel they could no longer replace, and their weapons' accuracy degraded as the targeting systems struggled to account for the light-bending effects of the massive star. Declan had positioned the Allied ships outside the worst of the gravitational distortion, in lanes he had mapped using stellar cartography data that the Kelthari databases had not even known existed. Our ships could maneuver, theirs could not. The strike groups arrived at the kill zone within the 4-minute window. All 7, from 7 different vectors, perfectly synchronized. I watched Declan orchestrate the destruction of 80 Draxari warships in 11 minutes. He assigned targets to each strike group with the speed of a musician reading sheet music, his voice never rising above conversation level, his orders overlapping in sequences that the bridge crew executed without hesitation. Ships exploded on the tactical display in clusters, each destruction opening a gap that the next strike group exploited before the Draxari could close it. The Draxari tried to regroup. They tried to establish a defensive formation, but you cannot establish a defensive formation in a gravity well when your engines are straining against tidal forces and your supply lines have just ceased to exist. You can only burn fuel you do not have and fire ammunition you cannot replace. The battle lasted 37 minutes from the first shot to the last Draxari transmission. 80 warships destroyed, 42 disabled. The remainder of the vanguard scattered in full retreat toward the Valen expanse, their formation shattered, and their supply corridor in ruins behind them. I stood on the bridge of the Hargrave and looked at the debris field that had been an armada, and then I looked at the man sitting in the command chair. His hands were still relaxed. His pulse was 58 beats per minute. His face showed nothing but the same quiet focus I had seen every morning when he read his tactical journals over terrible coffee. I thought about the bird in the garden, the gentle hands, the soft voice, and I looked at the tactical display, where 80 ships had become wreckage, and I understood that those same hands, that same voice, that same impossible calm, it was always this. The peace was always built on top of this. Before I could speak, before anyone on the bridge could begin processing what had just happened, the long-range sensors screamed. A second armada, dropping out of fold space on the far side of the Kelthari home system, twice the size of the force we had just destroyed. They had not come through the Valen expanse. They had circled around the entire sector, approaching from a direction that no one had thought to monitor, because it required a fold space transit through a region of space that was supposed to be unnavigable. The colonies had been the distraction. The vanguard we had just defeated had been a feint, a sacrifice play designed to draw the Allied fleet out of position while the real attack force approached from the opposite direction. They were heading for the Keltari homeworld, 12 billion people. My father, my sisters, my nieces and nephews, including the one who had not been born yet. Everything and everyone I had ever known. I felt the blood drain from my face. I heard the bridge crew's voices collapse into sharp, frantic, overlapping reports. I heard alarms that I had not heard before, deeper and more urgent, alarms that meant something different from combat. These were the alarms that meant the word home. Declan looked at the sensor data, the new armada's composition, their trajectory, their speed, their estimated arrival at the Kelthari homeworld. Then he looked at me, and I saw something I had never seen in his eyes before. not calm, not focus, not the analytical precision that had carried him through the battle. Something older than all of those, something that burned in a frequency my species could feel but not name. Rage, cold, vast, and absolutely controlled. Not the kind that clouds judgment or shakes hands. The kind that strips everything away until the only thing left is purpose, hard and bright, and merciless as a blade. The Allied fleet was out of position. The gravity well battle had scattered our formation across a wide arc of space. Damaged ships were still recovering from the engagement. Crews had been cycling through combat stations for hours. Fuel reserves were depleted from the maneuvering-intensive fight in the distortion field. The Draxari Second Armada would reach the Kelthari homeworld in 6 hours. At maximum burn, pushing every engine in the fleet past safety limits, Declan calculated that we could make it in 5.5. But we would arrive with depleted fuel, damaged ships, and exhausted crews against a fresh, fully supplied enemy force that outnumbered us by a ratio that the tactical computer refused to display as odds because the number was too demoralizing. Every model on the command display showed defeat. Every simulation returned the same conclusion. The mathematical reality was unambiguous, and no amount of tactical brilliance could change the fundamental arithmetic of ships, guns, and fuel. Declan ignored the models. He opened a fleet-wide communication channel and spoke to every ship in the Allied force, Terran and Kelthari alike, in a voice that carried no fear, no uncertainty, and no room for argument. We burn. Now. Full military power. Every ship that can move, moves. Sleep in shifts, because the moment we arrive, we fight. Do not ask me for odds. Do not ask me for guarantees. I am asking you to fly faster than you have ever flown, and fight harder than you have ever fought, and I am asking you to do it for 12 billion people, who will never know your names. He closed the channel. The fleet moved. I found him alone in the corridor outside the bridge during the transit, leaning against the bulkhead with his eyes closed. The wartime energy that had sustained him through the battle was still burning, but beneath it, I could see something human and fragile, the exhaustion that he would not let anyone else see. I asked him if he had a plan. He opened his eyes and looked at me with an expression so naked and unguarded that it made my chest ache. I have your family's address on the homeworld, he said. That is enough of a plan. I did not know what to say to that. I stood beside him in the corridor of a warship burning through fold space toward a battle that mathematics said we could not win, and I did not know what to say to the man who had decided that the address of my family's home was a sufficient reason to ignore mathematics. During the transit, in the small hours when the lights on the Hargrave dimmed to simulate night and the crew not on watch tried to sleep in their acceleration couches, Declan and I sat together in the ready room behind the bridge. It was the first time we had been alone in a space that was not a corridor or a quarters unit since the day we met. I asked him why humans fight like this, not how. I had seen the how. I had watched him dismantle an armada with the precision of a surgeon and the patience of a stone. I wanted to know why. What was it inside the human species that made them capable of this? This terrifying, beautiful, incomprehensible willingness to throw themselves against impossible odds for people they had never met. He was quiet for a long time. Then he told me about Earth. He told me about a species that had spent 10,000 years at war with itself before it ever built a ship that could leave its atmosphere. A species that had invented the concept of genocide and then invented the concept of humanitarian intervention to counteract it. A species that could compose music that made its listeners weep with beauty and also build weapons that could crack a planet's crust. Every contradiction possible within a single biological form, humans had embodied it. They had been monsters and saints and everything between, often in the same generation, sometimes in the same individual. Every human alive, Declan said, carried the memory of every battlefield in their blood. Not literally, not genetically, but culturally, historically. They knew what they were capable of, because their ancestors had demonstrated the full spectrum of human potential, from the worst depths to the highest peaks, and had documented all of it with obsessive, unflinching honesty. The good ones, he said, the ones worth knowing. They spend their whole lives choosing not to let that inheritance define them. They build gardens. They learn languages badly. They make coffee that their wives hate and laugh about it, because laughter is a choice too, and it is a better choice than most of the alternatives. But when something they love is threatened, the choice inverts. The gentleness becomes the thing they set aside, and what is left underneath has been sharpened by 10,000 years of practice. I asked him if he loved me. He looked at me with those brown eyes, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw something fragile in them, not weakness, vulnerability, the kind that only exists in people who have something to lose. "I started loving you the morning you tried my coffee," he said. "You hated it. I watched your face, and I could see exactly how much you hated it. And you drank the entire cup because you did not want to waste it." That was when I knew. I did not tell him that I loved him too. Not with words. But I reached across the space between our chairs and took his hand, and he held it with the same careful gentleness he had used on the wounded bird in the garden, and we sat like that in the dimmed light of a warship racing toward a battle we were not supposed to survive, and it was the most honest moment I had ever experienced with anyone, human or Keltari. 5 hours and 27 minutes after the full burn order, the Allied fleet dropped out of fold space above the Kelthari homeworld. We were 3 minutes ahead of schedule. 3 minutes that Declan had squeezed out of engines that should not have been capable of producing them, through a series of micro-adjustments to the fold space harmonics that the Terran engineers would later describe as either brilliant or completely insane. The Draxari were already there. Their second armada hung in orbit above my homeworld, like a cloud of metal and fire. Hundreds of warships arranged in a bombardment formation that I recognized from intelligence briefings. It was the formation the Draxari used when they intended to reduce a planet's surface to ash, not conquest, extermination. They had already begun. The orbital defense grid, the network of weapons platforms and shield generators that protected the major population centers, was under sustained assault. I could see the flashes of impact on the tactical display, each one representing a section of shielding under fire, each one protecting millions of people who were huddled in shelters beneath the surface, listening to the thunder above their heads and wondering if they would survive the next hour. I could see the fires. Not on the display, through the bridge's forward viewports, the fires on the surface of my homeworld, visible from orbit, orange and yellow against the blue-green curve of the planet I had been born on, cities burning, forests burning, the landscape of my childhood dissolving under bombardment, while 12 billion people screamed. I heard myself make a sound, not a word, something older than language, something that came from a place in my chest that I did not know existed. Declan did not wait for formation. He did not wait for the fleet to assemble into a coordinated attack posture. He did not wait for anything. He drove the Hargrave directly into the Draxari line, full speed, weapons firing in every direction, the ship's engines roaring so loudly that the hull vibrated beneath my feet like a living thing, and the fleet followed, because Declan Holt was already in the fire, and they were not going to let him burn alone. The battle for the homeworld was nothing like the gravity well engagement. That had been surgical, precise. A chess game played with warships and gravitational physics. This was a brawl, close range, brutal, and so densely packed with ships that the tactical display became a smear of overlapping symbols that no one could fully read. Declan fought from the command chair for 3 hours without standing, without eating, without taking his hands off the controls. The bridge around him devolved into controlled chaos, damage reports and weapon status updates, and casualty notifications, blending into a continuous roar of information that he processed with the same terrifying efficiency I had witnessed before. He lost ships. The Allied cruiser Vaetharn took a direct hit to its reactor and broke apart, its crew of 400 dying in a flash of light that I saw through the viewport. The Terran frigate Callaway lost its entire forward section to a Draxari torpedo spread and drifted away from the battle, venting atmosphere from wounds that could not be sealed. Each loss registered in Declan's eyes. I saw it, a flicker, a tightening at the corners of his mouth, a brief, involuntary intake of breath. But his hands did not slow. His voice did not waver. He absorbed the losses the way a deep-rooted tree absorbs a storm, bending with each blow, but never breaking, never losing the central axis of focus that held everything together. He adapted. When the Draxari shifted their formation to concentrate fire on the Allied center, he extended the flanks and created enfilade firing positions that punished them from two angles simultaneously. When they responded by spreading their forces thin to counter the flanks, he drove a wedge through the weakened center and split their formation in half. When the two halves tried to reunite, he positioned fast attack ships in the gap and turned it into a killing corridor. The Keltari captains, the ones who had voted against his plan 3 days ago, the ones who had dismissed him as a treaty ornament, followed his orders without question, not because they had been convinced by argument, because they had seen what he was, and they wanted to survive. And survival in this battle meant following the voice of the man who moved through chaos like he had been born inside it. The Draxari flagship, the Eternal Mandate, loomed at the center of the enemy formation, like a mountain of black metal. 3 kilometers of armored hull, bristling with weapon systems that outgunned most of our remaining ships combined. It had been hanging back from the main engagement, using its escorts as a screen, while it continued the systematic bombardment of the surface below. The planetary shield generators were failing. The network of ground-based projectors that protected the capital city and its surrounding metropolitan zone was down to 40% capacity, and the Eternal Mandate's bombardment batteries were grinding through the remaining coverage with methodical, relentless precision. If those shields fell, 50 million people would die in the capital alone. The surrounding zones held another 100 million, and once the Draxari established orbital superiority over the capital, the remaining population centers would fall one by one. Declan made a decision. I did not understand it at first. The orders came too fast, the calculations too dense, the implications too enormous for my mind to assemble into a coherent picture, while the ship shook, and the alarms screamed, and the fires of my homeworld burned in the viewport behind me. He turned the Hargrave directly toward the Eternal Mandate. Not on an attack vector, on a collision course. He was not going to ram the dreadnought. The Hargrave was a fraction of the Eternal Mandate's mass, and a collision would destroy us without significantly damaging the enemy flagship. That was not the point. The point was attention. Declan drove our ship straight at the largest, most heavily armed vessel in the Draxari fleet, and every weapon the Eternal Mandate possessed turned to face us. Hundreds of gun batteries, torpedo launchers, energy projectors designed to crack planetary shielding, all of it, the full devastating firepower of a 3-kilometer dreadnought, focused on a single ship crewed by 312 people who followed their commander into the mouth of annihilation because he asked them to. The Hargrave shook. Not vibrated. Shook, the way a structure shakes when the forces acting on it exceed its design tolerances. Hull breaches opened along the port side. Fires erupted on 3 decks simultaneously. Systems began failing in cascades that the damage control teams could not contain. The lights on the bridge flickered, died, came back at half power, flickered again. I was thrown from my observation position by a concussion wave that I later learned was a torpedo impact on the deck directly below us. I hit the railing hard enough to open a gash along my left arm, and I felt the warm wetness of my own blood soaking through my sleeve. Declan did not look at me. He could not. He was counting seconds. 28 seconds. That was the window he had calculated. 28 seconds, during which every Draxari gun was pointed at the Hargrave, and not at the Allied fleet maneuvering behind the Eternal Mandate. The strike came from 4 directions simultaneously. Allied ships that Declan had repositioned during the preceding hours of battle. Ships that had seemed to be fighting their own engagements on the periphery, but had actually been threading through the chaos toward predetermined firing positions around the dreadnought. They hit the Eternal Mandate's engines first, then its weapon arrays, then its communication systems. The dreadnought shuddered. Its guns stopped firing. Its engines flickered and died. 3 kilometers of the most powerful warship the Draxari Ascendancy had ever built went dark in the space of 90 seconds, crippled by a coordinated strike that had been timed to a 28-second window, created by one man's willingness to put his own ship in front of every gun the enemy had. I pushed myself upright against the railing, blood running down my arm, and I looked at Declan in the command chair. His face was lit by the emergency lighting, red and flickering, and I saw something on it that I had never seen before and would never see again. Not triumph. Not satisfaction. Relief. The kind of relief that only comes when you have gambled everything on a single moment, and the moment held. I understood then what Celtari poets meant when they wrote about gods. They were not writing about power. They were not writing about invincibility or perfection, or the absence of fear. They were writing about sacrifice. The willingness to stand between destruction and the thing you love, and say, "Through me first." That is what makes a god. Not strength. Choice. Declan had absorbed the fury of an empire, so that a world he had no biological connection to could survive. He had done it knowing that the next second might be his last, knowing that the ship might break apart around him, knowing that he might die in the dark between the stars for a people who had been his enemies 6 weeks ago. He did it anyway, because he had my family's address, because he had made a promise, because he was human, and humans do not need to be invincible to be willing. The bridge shook again, smaller this time. Secondary explosions from the damage we had already sustained. The Hargrave was still holding together, but barely. Structural integrity was at 30%. Life support was failing on 4 decks. One of the engine pods was gone entirely. But the Eternal Mandate was dark. And the planetary shields were holding. Then the transmission came through. The Draxari commander aboard the Eternal Mandate, speaking on an open channel that every ship in the battle could hear. His voice was sharp, metallic, filtered through translation systems that stripped the words of emotion and left only their meaning. If they could not have the Kelthari homeworld, they would destroy it. The Eternal Mandate carried a cascade weapon in its core, a device designed to be detonated as a final act of denial, a technology that the Draxari had used twice before, against worlds that resisted them too effectively. The detonation would crack the planet's crust. 12 billion people. My father, my sisters, the child that Maisha had not yet delivered. 90 seconds. That was how long the Draxwari commander said he would wait before activating the device. I felt the deck shift beneath me. Not from an explosion. From movement. Declan was standing. For the first time in over 3 hours, he rose from the command chair, and I saw his legs nearly buckle beneath him. He was wounded. I could see it now, the dark stain spreading across the left side of his uniform where shrapnel had penetrated during one of the earlier hull breaches. He had been injured for hours. He had commanded a battle, calculated a 28-second window, and driven his ship into the face of a dreadnought's full firepower, while bleeding from a wound he had never mentioned. He steadied himself against the arm of the chair. He looked at me. "Get to the escape pods," he said. "No," I said. "Say, Lara. Whatever you are about to do, I am watching." Something moved across his face. Not an expression I could name. Something older. Something that existed in the space between fear and determination, where humans keep the things they cannot say out loud. He turned back to the command console. Declan overrode the Hargrave's remaining systems. I watched him work the console with hands that should not have been steady, but were, rerouting power from every system on the ship. Life support, gravity generators, radiation shielding, navigation, point defense weapons, all of it, every watt of energy the Hargrave could still produce, channeled into a single system. The main lance battery, a weapon designed for sustained anti-capital ship engagement, capable of cutting through armored hulls at distances measured in light seconds. Declan was not using it for sustained engagement. He was concentrating every available joule into a single shot. The shot had to hit the Eternal Mandate's core housing, a target approximately 40 meters wide, buried beneath 300 meters of armor plating that had already been compromised by the earlier strike, but not penetrated. If the lance hit true, with enough energy behind it, it would breach the core housing and destabilize the Cascade weapon's containment field. The weapon would collapse inward instead of detonating outward. The dreadnought would consume itself, and the planet would survive. If he missed, or if the energy yield was insufficient to breach the remaining armor, the core would detonate as designed. And 12 billion people would die. There was no targeting computer available. The combat systems had been among the first casualties of the Eternal Mandate's barrage. There was no AI assist. The processing cores were offline. There was only Declan Holt, standing at a manual firing console, with blood soaking through his uniform, and his legs trembling beneath him, doing math in his head, that should have required a team of specialists and a computational array. I counted the seconds, not because I wanted to, because I could not stop. He adjusted the lance's azimuth by fractions of a degree, his fingers moving with a precision that defied the shaking of his body and the shaking of the ship around him. He compensated for the gravitational drift of both vessels, for the rotational spin of the Eternal Mandate's crippled hull, for the energy decay rate of the lance at the current power level, for a dozen other variables that I could not identify but that he held in his mind simultaneously, each one a thread in a calculation that would determine whether my species lived or died. 4 seconds remained when he fired. The lance struck the Eternal Mandate amidships, a beam of focused energy that crossed the distance between our ships in less time than it takes to blink. It hit the compromised section of the dreadnought's hull and punched through 300 meters of armor plating like a needle through cloth, reaching the core housing and breaching the containment field with a force that exceeded the weapon's rated specifications by a factor that the Terran engineers would later call theoretically impossible. The Cascade weapon's containment collapsed inward. The Eternal Mandate did not explode. It folded. The physics of a Cascade containment failure in reverse created a gravitational anomaly that compressed the dreadnought's mass toward its center, 3 kilometers of warship crushing itself into a space that grew smaller and smaller and smaller until the sensors could no longer resolve it, and it simply vanished, like a star collapsing into a singularity. The Keltari homeworld survived. The silence afterward was the loudest thing I had ever heard. No weapons fire, no alarms, no screaming engines or shattering hull plates. Just the soft whisper of the Hargraves emergency ventilation system pushing recycled air through corridors that were half destroyed, and the quiet hum of the bridge's remaining systems running on reserve power. The Draxhari fleet, what remained of it, scattered. Without the Eternal Mandate, without their supply corridor, without their commander, they broke and ran in every direction, individual ships and small formations fleeing toward the Valen expanse with no coordination and no plan. They were not retreating. They were fleeing, driven by the primal recognition that they had encountered something they did not understand and could not defeat. Declan Holt collapsed in the command chair. I reached him before anyone else on the bridge. He was conscious but barely, his eyes unfocused and his skin pale beneath the emergency lighting. His wound was worse than I had realized. The shrapnel had penetrated deeper than I thought, and the internal bleeding that he had been suppressing through sheer willpower for the past 3 hours had finally exceeded his body's ability to compensate. I held him. I pressed my hands against the wound and shouted for medical teams, and felt his blood, red and warm and very human, soak through my fingers. He looked up at me with eyes that were losing focus, and he said something in a voice so quiet that I had to lean close to hear it. "The bird," he mumbled. "In the garden. It flew away eventually. That is the part people forget. The rescue is not the story. The flying away is." I did not understand. Not then. Not while medical teams were cutting away his uniform and injecting him with compounds that smelled like metal and ozone. Not while they carried him off the bridge on a stretcher. And I followed with his blood on my hands and my own wound still bleeding. And neither of those things mattering at all compared to the shallow rise and fall of his chest. He spent 2 weeks in a medical bay on the Keltari homeworld, the same world he had nearly died to protect. I barely left his side. I slept in a chair beside his bed. I ate when the nurses reminded me. I held his hand during the periods when the medications pulled him under, and his fingers twitched with the ghosts of battles that his sleeping mind could not stop fighting. The scale of what had happened became clear during those 2 weeks, delivered to me in briefings and intelligence reports that I read in the dim light of his hospital room while he slept. The Draxhari Ascendancy had lost 70% of its expeditionary fleet, not just the ships destroyed in the 2 engagements, but the vessels that had fled afterward, scattered and leaderless, running out of fuel in unfamiliar space, with no supply corridor to return to. Many of them would never make it back to Draxhari territory. The ones that did would arrive with empty fuel tanks and shattered morale, carrying the story of what had happened to them in Keltari space. The supply corridor itself was gone. 7 strike groups had destroyed every relay station, every fuel depot, every communications node along its entire 400 light-year length. The infrastructure that had taken the Draxuri decades to build had been dismantled in less than 48 hours. And the cascade effect was only beginning. Intelligence reports from deep-cover assets in Draxuri territory indicated that the 11 species the Ascendancy had conquered over the past 60 years were stirring. News of the defeat had spread through the occupied territories like fire through dry grass, and for the first time in generations, the conquered peoples were looking at their oppressors and seeing something they had never seen before. Weakness. The Draxari core worlds were recalling all remaining military forces, not to regroup for another assault on Keltari space, but to defend against the uprisings that were already erupting across their empire. Declan had not just won a battle. He had not just saved a planet. He had broken the spine of an empire that had terrorized a quarter of the galaxy for 60 years. And he had done it with a patchwork fleet, a plan designed in hours, and a species he had married into 5 weeks earlier. My father contacted me on a private channel during the second week. His face was composed, as always, but I could see the weight behind his eyes, the cumulative impact of what he had witnessed, the bombardment, the fires, the rescue, the silence afterward. He asked me how Declan was recovering. I told him the doctors were optimistic. Then he asked a question I never expected to hear from the man who had ruled the Kelthari sovereignty for 30 years, who had fought wars and brokered treaties and navigated political crises that would have broken lesser leaders. What are humans, he asked. Not who, not how, what. I did not have an answer for him then. I have one now. Declan woke fully on the 15th day. I was sitting beside his bed, reading a tactical analysis report that one of his officers had submitted about the gravity well engagement. He opened his eyes, blinked against the light, and looked at me with the same calm brown gaze that had greeted me in a garden on Threshold Station a lifetime ago. He did not ask about the battle. He did not ask about the strategic aftermath, or the Draxari retreat, or the political implications of what had happened. He did not ask about any of the things that military commanders are supposed to ask about when they wake up after saving a civilization. He asked me if I had eaten. I stared at him. I held the tactical report in one hand, and his blood oath bracelet in the other, the bracelet the medical team had removed from his wrist during surgery, and that I had kept in my pocket since. And I stared at the most dangerous man I had ever encountered, and he asked me if I had eaten. Then he asked if my family was safe. He said their names. My father, Talira, Mesha. He had remembered them. He had filed them away in the same mind that held fleet formations and gravitational calculations and supply chain vulnerabilities. And the first thing he retrieved when he woke from a 2-week medical coma was the names of the people I loved. Then he asked about the bird. And I understood. He was not asking about the bird in the garden on Threshold Station. He was asking about the homeworld. He was asking if the planet he had nearly died to protect had survived, and if the people on it were rebuilding, and if life was returning to the places where the fires had burned. Had it flown away? I told him everything. I told him about the Draxari retreat, about the supply corridor's destruction, about the uprisings in Draxari territory, about the intelligence reports, and the strategic assessments, and the diplomatic communications that were already flowing between the Kelthari sovereignty and a dozen other species who wanted to join the alliance he had forged in fire. And then I told him the truth that I had been carrying since the bridge of the Hargrave, the truth that I had not been able to say while he was sleeping, because saying it to an unconscious man felt dishonest, and I wanted him to hear it properly. I told him he had terrified me. I told him I had watched him become something ancient and unstoppable, something that moved through warfare like a force of nature, and that I did not know how to reconcile the man who learned my language badly on purpose and adjusted kitchen settings and knelt in gardens, with the man who had stared down a dreadnought and done math in his bleeding head that saved 12 billion lives. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said something that I have carried with me every day since. You do not have to reconcile them. They are not two people. They are one person who made a promise and kept it the only way he knew how. He told me that humans do not fight like gods. Gods do not bleed. Gods do not choose. Gods are immortal and untouchable, and they act from a position of absolute safety, dispensing judgment without risk. Humans bleed. Humans choose. Humans stand in front of dreadnoughts and do math with shrapnel in their sides and feel every second of fear that a mortal body can produce, and they do it anyway. That is not divinity. That is something harder than divinity. That is will, applied against impossible odds by a fragile creature that knows it can break. I held his hand while he spoke, and I felt his pulse beneath my fingers, steady and human and finite, and I loved him with a completeness that I had not known I was capable of. 6 months passed. The Keltari-Terran alliance transformed from a reluctant political arrangement, sealed by a transactional marriage, into the most formidable partnership in the known galaxy. Not because of the treaty. Not because of the diplomats or the politicians, or the carefully worded agreements that filled hundreds of pages of legal text. Because of what happened when the Draxhari came, and what two species did when they stood together against annihilation instead of apart. Other species petitioned to join. The Vel'ari, the Sindari, the Outer Reach Collective. Even species that had previously maintained strict neutrality in galactic affairs sent ambassadors to Threshold Station to discuss terms of alliance, because word had spread across the galaxy about what had happened in Kelthari space, and every species that heard the story reached the same conclusion. An alliance that included humans was an alliance that could survive anything. The Draxari ascendancy collapsed entirely within 4 months of the battle. The 11 conquered species, emboldened by the defeat of the expeditionary fleet, rose up in a coordinated rebellion that the weakened ascendancy could not suppress. 60 years of conquest unraveled in a season. The Draxari core worlds, stripped of their military forces, and surrounded by liberated populations that had very long memories and very little interest in mercy, retreated behind their borders, and have not emerged since. The marriage that was supposed to be a symbol became real, not because of the war, though the war was part of it. Not because of the sacrifice, though the sacrifice was part of it too. It became real because of the mornings. The quiet mornings when Declan made coffee that I still hated, and I drank it anyway, because the ritual mattered more than the taste. The evenings when he read Keltari poetry out loud, his pronunciation still terrible, and I corrected him and he got it wrong again on purpose, because my laughter was worth more to him than accuracy. He returned to the garden on Threshold Station. The bird was gone, recovered, and released weeks ago by a maintenance technician who had found it in the ventilation system. But the garden was still there, and Declan planted new things in it. Kelthari dusk bloom flowers alongside Terran roses, purple and red growing together in the same soil, under the same artificial sunlight, their roots tangling beneath the surface in ways that neither species of plant would have chosen on its own. I watched him kneel in the dirt, murmuring to the seedlings the way he once murmured to that wounded bird, his hands gentle and his voice low, and his entire being focused on the small, quiet act of making something grow. And I understood. The violence was never who he was. It was what he was willing to become for the things he loved. The war was not his nature. It was his capability, held in reserve behind a wall of deliberate gentleness, deployed only when the alternative was unthinkable, and then set aside the moment it was no longer needed. And the garden, the quiet, the patience, the terrible coffee, and the mispronounced poetry, and the careful hands that could dismantle an empire and plant a flower on the same day, that was what he was willing to fight to return to. So, I was sent to marry a human for peace. I watched that human wage war in ways that made admirals weep and empires crumble. I saw him bleed and calculate and sacrifice and endure, and I saw the universe bend around him like space bending around a star, not because he was invincible, but because he refused to stop. But the thing I carry with me now, the thing I will teach our children when they are old enough to understand it, is not the war. It is not the gravity well, or the 28-second window, or the lance shot that saved a world with 4 seconds remaining. It is the morning after. The morning when the most dangerous man I have ever known woke up in a hospital bed, looked at me with tired eyes, and asked if I had eaten. That is humanity. Not the fire, not the fury, not the impossible, terrifying, godlike capacity for destruction that lives inside every one of them like a sleeping sun. The asking, the gentle, persistent, stubborn asking, "Are you safe? Are you fed? Are you warm? Do you need anything? Can I help?" Always, always the asking. And the willingness, when the asking fails, when the gentle words are not enough, when something dark and vast and merciless threatens the people they have asked about, to become the fire. Not because they want to, because they choose to. Because the asking matters enough to fight for, and the fighting matters enough to survive, and the surviving matters enough to come home and kneel in a garden and whisper to the flowers and start the whole beautiful, terrible cycle again. For peace, I married a human, and I watched him wage war like a god. But the god came home. He always comes home. He comes home and he asks if you have eaten, and he plants something in the garden, and he holds you with hands that have ended empires and saved worlds, and those hands are gentle, because gentleness is the choice he makes every single morning. That is the part people forget. The rescue is not the story. The flying away is. The living after. The choosing softness when you have proven you are capable of anything but. That is the story. That is the only story that matters. And it is mine.